Hello and welcome back to Protect Life here, breaking the consensus. Today I am delighted to welcome you back to the conversation. And before we start today, I'd like to invite you, first of all, to see that subscribe button. If you could hit that, that means that any new information, any new product that we have and new content will be directly told about it. The second thing is, as you know, we have a lot of campaigns we're still engaged in. There are fights we're still fighting, and we need your help, particularly in this time of pandemic when we can't get out amongst you. So the donate button, is there anything you can give, will be really appreciated, and I can promise will be used to the best of our abilities. Today I am talking to Gary Kavanagh. Gary may be known to you already as an investigative journalist working with Gript Media. During the repeal campaign, Gary was also the director of strategic research for the pro-life groupings opposing the repeal of the 8th Amendment. We're going to, it's not a happy topic today, we're looking at the most recent report on the situation of Ireland post-repeal, and it's the second annual report. And we're just going to, Gary is a bit of a numbers man, but more than a bit of a numbers man, and he's going to go through some of the details. We'll have a look at maybe a little bit of, well, I suppose what we were told was going to be the situation and what is actually effectuated. And ultimately a reflection on how we were sold a lie and now we're being sold another one. But Gary, you've been going through the report. Can you give us just a general first, just to start off, a general sense of what the report this year is saying?
I can, and thanks for having me on, Michael. The report this year is quite similar to the report we saw last year in the headline number of abortions. In 2019, you were looking at 6,666. In 2020, that stayed relatively steady at 6,577. The reports that the governments are putting out, they have a fair amount of statistical detail, but most of it is relatively useless. It's things like what month were abortions in. So you can throw that into Excel and see if January is more likely than June, but it doesn't really tell you anything about what's happening here, the people who are involved, the women who are involved, the reasons, things like that. And most of it is fairly intuitive. So really, I think the most important figure that this report contains is the breakdown of the cause of the abortion, or the cause that was medically noticed for the abortion. We all know how the referendum was sold. It was on a protection of women's lives basis. But when you look at these figures, in 2019, as I said, you saw 6,666 abortions. Of those, 21 were notified as being due to a risk to life or health of the mother. And 3 of those were risk to life or health in an emergency situation. 6,542 of them were termed as happening due to early pregnancy. And that is to say that they happened before the 12th week, and so no other reason is necessary to give.
Right.
So they would be maybe due to socioeconomic reasons, due to whatever reason the parents had, but it would not be related to any risk to their health or their life. Or, and I think this is also important to note, they would also not be due or not be notified as being due to any condition that was likely to lead to the death of the child shortly after birth. These would be an entirely separate category, effectively. Then that when we look at things, abortions that were carried out to what they term conditions likely to lead to the death of the fetus, in 2019 there were 100 of those, 1.5% of all abortions. Early pregnancy abortions are 98.14% of all abortions in this country, which is actually very similar to what we see in England.
You may have been partly responsible. During the repeal campaign, I remember there was a poster which was put out, which was in fact on the basis of the English figures, which said that 97% of abortions in England took place on healthy babies. I think it was healthy babies or healthy women and healthy babies. My recollection is that we were pretty well savaged about that.
Yeah, I know I worked on similar messages during the campaign myself and did some of the research that went into them. And yes, we were very, roundly savaged by them. I think there were multiple fact checks. It was described as outrageous, fear-mongering, and simply presented as being absolutely wrong and totally indefensible. And there are a couple of technical ways you can cut down abortions. So you can present abortions as a percentage of pregnancies, or you can present them as, you know, you can do it per the amount of women who could give birth, or you can look at people who are pregnant. So there's always, with something like this, there's always small statistical arguments you can make, but that's not what was being made here. We were simply being told, that's outrageous, that's wrong, that's indefensible. And unfortunately, when we now look at the actual results in Ireland, we see nearly a replication of what we saw in England. I don't think that was terribly surprising to anyone who had looked at the data we've seen in various European countries about this. It was absolutely foreseeable. It was simply unacceptable to particular people who didn't want to say it was likely to happen.
Now, if we look at the figures that we have from this year and last year, one of the objections, or one of the arguments that was put forward by the people opposed to repeal, was that the Eighth Amendment had actually reduced the number of abortions. That if we looked at the numbers of people going to England, that the number would have been considerably higher, other than the fact of the fact of the amendment here. And this again was pretty hotly contested. The idea, I think, generally was this was nonsense, that anybody who wanted an abortion was going to go to England to get one. And really what we were doing was creating a situation where we were exporting the problem. Anybody who wanted an abortion would get one in England, but now they were being forced, in difficult circumstances, in cases of children, say children with life-limiting conditions, etc., they were being forced to go to England. When we look at the numbers that we had before the repeal and the numbers now, has that been borne out?
So I think the first thing to note there is that it's quite difficult to actually pin down exactly how many people went over to England. And then there were also issues with pills that could be used to induce abortion being imported into the country. And we've got some details on that based on how many were seized by customs, but you don't really have an exact figure on it. Looking, however, at the figures we do have available to us, and I've gone back through the figures that were promoted during the referendum by those seeking to remove the Eighth Amendment, it would appear that the numbers have increased considerably. I know the abortion rights campaign said that on average, 10 women travel from Ireland to Britain every day for an abortion. It was said that there had been about 170,000 women who had sought abortions in England over, at that point, the last 37 years. And all of that, when you break it down, works out to a figure somewhere in the region of 3,500 to 4,000, depending on the exact figures you use, traveling to England. As we are currently sitting at about 6,500, it would appear that the number has effectively gone up by half again in a very, very short period of time. And I don't think that was terribly surprising to anyone, again, who had looked at it, because if you have a situation where you make it easier to acquire something and you legalize it in a country, you would then, you obviously make it easier to get, but you also normalize the process to a degree. It becomes more of an accepted part of that culture and its medical practice. So for that to happen and for the numbers to have not gone up would have been very, very surprising. Particularly, well, surprising to certain people, I should say.
Well, I absolutely take what you say, but is it perhaps just surprising in this regard that it happened so quickly? I know a lot of us had expected that ultimately we would see an increase in the global numbers, but there had been expectation. I don't know quite on what basis we believed this, but there had been expectation that it might take a number of years. And I certainly remember that people on the repeal side said, no, at the beginning, you may see a number, but it'll be a matter of hundreds. It'll be a small number, but there was a sense that it would take time. It would take a change in culture before this would happen. But that if there is a surprise, the surprise is that it happened immediately.
I think so. Although when you actually, when you think about it, once it became legal, it therefore became something that could be offered to you by your doctors and something that you could consider. Whereas before it would have been something that you might have had to seek out, and you would have to then go to the effort of looking into it and all of these things. Once you remove that barrier, there would obviously be a certain amount of people who would then go for it, who would not otherwise have been willing to invest the amount of effort or even considered it as a serious option. But as I said, once you legalize something, once you make it a standard part of the medical discourse and culture of society, I don't think it's surprising that you see this sudden jump. Now, what I would expect now is we will start seeing things trend either upwards or downwards more slowly. But I think what happened is when you legalized it, you had, I wouldn't say latent demand, but you had people who wouldn't otherwise have considered it. And so there was always going to be an immediate movement. And I think everyone expected that to be upwards, bar certain politicians and activists.
Just, I mean, it's a small enough detail in the numbers, although in each individual case, it's a tragedy. But while the global number this year is lower than last year's, insofar as I could see from the figures, it's also true that the total number of pregnancies was lower this year, and the actual the proportion of abortions per 1,000 pregnancies actually is higher than the previous year.
It has, and one other thing that I think is particularly interesting here is, while the headline figure has gone down by about 100 abortions this year, the percentage of those abortions that were due to early pregnancy has actually gone up. Now, it's only moved from 98.14% to 98.15%, but it is interesting that we can see a drop in the overall numbers, but have the early pregnancy number remain relatively static and go up slightly. So I think that is going to be concerning moving forward, particularly now that we have an ongoing debate that there are too many restrictions on this. I know some of the activist groups are still campaigning to loosen those restrictions, to change some of the reporting requirements. And I know similarly there has been a push to remove some of the detail from these reports, so that it's simply, the only legitimate reason I can see for that is to make it more difficult for people to actually do these kind of analysis and see what is actually happening here.
Sorry, you were saying that there's a push on to reduce detailed information regarding certain elements of the reporting. What's that about?
Yeah, so that comes as part of the overall push we've seen for looser restrictions in this. I don't think that was surprising to anyone, for all the talk that this was, the ultimate end point of this movement. I don't think anyone actually expected that to be the case. We're now seeing a push for looser restrictions in place, and expansion of particularly the current provision that allows abortion up to 12 weeks for any purpose or no purpose at all, really, as the law is written, an expansion of that. And part of that, there have been continuous complaints from certain individuals and groups about some of the reporting requirements, particularly the reporting requirements around early pregnancy, because I think these groups have probably quite accurately realized that some of the statistics in that area do not look particularly good for them, considering that some of these people argued persuasively and at length that abortion was going to be rare, and that it was only going to be done in these very particular circumstances. And I mean, when you look at the statistics and see 98% in early pregnancy, that's not rare, and that's not being done for reasons of health, or at least it's not being notified as having been done due to a reason for health. So I think that is their concern there, that the statistics are quite bad. And if the statistics are bad, remove the statistics.
I obviously don't want to relitigate that time that we went through together during the campaign, but it was always, I think, your belief ultimately that the debate would revolve around our capacity, or their capacity, to convince the Irish voting public whether or not women were dying because of an absence of abortion in Ireland. That was the key issue. And we could talk around lots of other stuff, but that was the key. And if they could succeed in using whatever stories went, Halapanava story or whatever, that would be no. We have had some polling post factum, etc., about the attitudes of those people who voted for repeal. And well, first I'll ask you: do you think it would be correct to say that it isn't true? We should not assume that people who voted for repeal necessarily were sympathetic or at all to a very liberal, unrestricted abortion regime.
I think that's a very important point to make. And there's a lot you can talk about in relation to that. But to start with, I think to the average person is not very highly involved in politics. They don't follow the news to an incredible degree. They don't passively take it in, but they kind of pick up more the general tone of coverage than a lot of the times the sort of scandals and things that will come up to people who are more politically engaged. And that's not in any way a slur on them. You have a limited amount of time in your life, and some people make the very wise decision to spend a lot more with their family and a lot less of it worrying about certain political matters. And to these people, they had about a decade of being told that the Eighth Amendment was killing women. And you had cases like Savita Halapanara, which was presented in a very particular light. But I think equally important, it was also presented as, while it was sort of, the standard bearer, as being not unusual, as being a standard occurrence in Irish hospitals by a lot of the media. I mean, by the time we got to the referendum, you had every major political party in support of it. In relation to the newspapers, pretty much every newspaper was openly in support of it. Some openly so, saying that their editorial line was for repeal, some without making that distinction. And if you are a person who, let's say, is not fully up to date on something like this, but all you know of it is for a decade you have been told that this kills women, even if you dislike it, even if you hate it, can you in good faith vote to keep it? And I would argue that that's where a lot of this fell. You had a lot of people who were deeply uncomfortable with this and may have been morally or philosophically opposed to this, but they believed the line that was being given about it. And once you believe that, it becomes very morally difficult. And I think that has to be taken into account, particularly when talking to people about it. Now, that wasn't everyone. There were people absolutely who voted this in because they thought it would be useful to them. I know men who did that because they were thinking, what if I ever get a woman pregnant? This is a way out. But I don't think that was the majority of people. I think the majority of people made what they thought was the best option here. They went for what they thought was the thing that most reduced harm.
Yeah. I think that's an important point that you referred to there. I think that it's something that activists and people who are deeply involved very often have a problem fully understanding. That if you're not completely engaged in something, there's an idea in economics called opportunity cost, which leads into the value of a brand. You buy a brand because you have faith in the brand, and that saves you having to wander, trying to experiment one idea after another idea. And if you're not engaged, if you're a citizen, just an ordinary person who's trying to pay attention but has lots of other things happening in their lives, and I think we have to understand from the perspective of the non-activist. As you said, every political party in the country was saying, this is true. Pretty well every newspaper was saying it. Every trades union was saying it. Virtually every civic organization was saying it. Now, if you're a citizen, it's very, very difficult to reach a position and say, I'm going to say that all of these people are lying to me. All of these are, at the very best, all of these people are mistaken. Because what does that then mean for my wider civic understanding of the country I live in? If every major politician that I trust in my political party, the people that are in my trades union, the people are all wrong. So even if, as you say, I think you might have a visceral or indeed a philosophical problem, even despite for abortion, if they say this is happening, it's very difficult for you to stand and say, well, everybody else is wrong except me. And then you've got these these activists. So I think that people in the campaigns have to understand that. But these people are not. Okay, this may be a slightly unfair question to you, but you're a fairly objective kind of a person on this. When you look at these figures and you look at I mean, how effectively restrictive is the regime in Ireland?
Well, before 12 weeks, it's not restrictive at all. You can get an abortion for any reason or no reason, as the law is written. And I know this was hotly contested during the referendum, but as we saw during the referendum, when anytime any politician or activist was asked to point out where in the legislation there were restrictions during that period, they were unable to point to any restrictions because there are none. Now, once you get over 12 weeks, then you're into a different field. And yes, there are restrictions. Now, it's even then it's broader than it was traditionally in Ireland, but it is much restricted. It couldn't be less restricted. So it had to go in one direction. And that, I think, is why we are now seeing a push to basically go to abortion on demand up to whatever point people think is necessary. But as it stands, it is exactly as it was going to be during the referendum, as people were told it wasn't going to be. But this is clearly what the legislation was going to do, and it has done it.
If I can find it here, I'd like to just give you a quote that if you could maybe translate for us, if you like. In a report from RTE, it's talking about, it's curious, a piece of research was done on the restrictions that are still in place. And in the account of this, the research eventually, after 3 paragraphs, becomes a report. And I quote the paragraph here. The report recommends that the legislative review, which they want a legislative review of which will happen, I think it's an automatic thing after 3 years from repeal, there has to be a complete legislative review. The review process should be wholly independent of government and be chaired by a specialist in reproductive rights and equality-based healthcare. And the review group should be composed of a panel of experts, including service users, providers, and reproductive rights advocates. I think that's well, what's your first reaction to that?
My first reaction to that is it's a list of the groups you usually hear called stakeholders, but would more rightly be called just vested interests. That is the sort of panel you put together because you want a very particular answer and you want absolutely no doubt that it is going to reach that answer. It's absolutely unsurprising. This review is why we've seen activism start kicking up again. This is the chance to widen this again and push it to something even more extreme. So I am utterly unsurprised that someone would try and put out these sort of ideas at that point, partially because if you get them, well, then you'll get anything you want, but also because they make other suggestions look less extreme and reasonable in comparison. So you can now turn around and go, okay, maybe we'll let someone on from one of the other groups, or maybe we'll do it this way. And it looks now relatively much more, it's not a progressive suggestion, it's a centrist suggestion, because we could have gone with this thing. And so I'm utterly unsurprised. And we're going to be seeing more of it as well as we move more strongly into the review. Abortion is going to become an issue again very shortly. That was actually one of the things I noted during the campaign. There was this tone of, well, if we deal with it now, we'll never have to deal with abortion again. And having looked at what happened in other countries, that's not the case. What happens is if you remove abortion from the constitution, if you bring it into law, well, now it's a political matter because any government can change it. So these people will never want for work again. There will always be a need to advocate for further liberalizations, and they will keep doing that. The general public, I think, will forget about this nearly entirely. Now that it's voted on, I doubt anyone even thinks of it outside of those who had an interest in it. So what we will see moving forward is small groups of activists in academia, in journalism, and in civic society trying to push this as far as they can go. And those groups in Ireland have had, not just in relation to abortion, in relation to a lot of things, have had outstanding success. So I think what would be necessary there is a countervailing push from people delivered in the appropriate way to ensure there is still some counterbalance there. Because while the referendum is over, these people have not stopped caring about it, and they're going to continue agitating until they get something which is, I would imagine, for any or no reason, well, I mean, I was going to say up to viability, but a lot of these people would want to go beyond that. So I think that does just really kind of bring home the need for there to be continuous movement on this and pressure put on civic society, newspapers, politicians, that there are those with other views on this that should be considered. It's not something that's simply been signed, sealed, delivered, and now we just take it as far as we can go.
What do you? I think one of the things that struck me about well, as I said, I like the fact that we have this progression. At the beginning, this is research, and then 3 paragraphs later, it's a report. I think the word report carries its own sort of subliminal message with it. It's a report, it's not research. But it says it should be wholly independent of government. Am I cynical in thinking that this is not simply a one-way street? It's not simply that the activists want the politicians out of it, but the politicians are very happy to stay out of it. The politicians may be happy to see what the activists want implemented, but they don't want to be seen to be involved with it.
Yeah, there will be that to a degree. Also, putting it to an independent body means it's not a political decision, even if it is absolutely a political decision. It's simply that experts have considered this, and they've come to the absolute right arrangement on it. We could see that with the Citizens' Assembly. There was a period when the Citizens' Assembly came back, when it was talking about abortion, came back with a finding that was not what was expected from some of the pro-choice activists. And these people turned on it like that. They were talking about its illegitimacy, how you couldn't get people into a room for a couple of weekends and that they would know anything. And then the Citizens' Assembly came back with an even more extreme position. And suddenly those same people turned around, and this was, absolutely beyond remark. This was just this showed what people can do when they sit down and listen to the evidence. And there are always going to be people who find that very helpful if that is what you want to do politically, because then it's not your choice. But I think, and this is an important point, there are also politicians who would themselves be either personally pro-life or politically would be in that space, but who now think that this is a problem. This is a potential vote loser for them. And they don't want to have to be the people who go in and either come behind something or in any way are seen to be supporting it. They would rather that this went to an independent group and they could have absolutely no hands on it. And I think in some of those cases, there's politicians who may present a very sort of pro-life facing front will be very happy to just leave this to someone else and do absolutely nothing against it because they don't want to touch it.
But from the point of view of future legislation, isn't it the fact that if we get to the point where there is such an independent group ultimately tasked with giving the shape to the future legislation, first of all, it won't be independent in the sense that it will be what it is composed of, and the people that compose it, we will know pretty well from the get-go what it happens. If we get to that point, in a sense, the argument is already over. I remember years ago being told by a politician, amateurs in politics think that decisions are made by committees in the room. The decisions are actually made before you go into the room. In fact, before the committee is formed.
Yeah, it's true in politics. It's also true, I think, in media. When a lot of people talk about media bias, it's not that they will explicitly lie to you or misrepresent things. It's that they will only cover certain things. They'll only give certain people prominence. They won't talk about certain stories at all. So you can never say, you lied to me, but the end result is absolutely dishonest in where it brings you. And I think with something like that, you're right, they won't be independent. Also, they likely won't be independent because they will almost certainly be majority funded by the state, which is a tactic beloved of the Irish state to create an independent group, which is totally funded by the state, and which then lobbies the state to do the things the state wanted to do anyway. If a group like that were to be created, on one hand, it would depend how they are set up. They would most likely just be an advisory board. But what it would ensure is that the advisory board would only ever come back with one movement on this, to make things more liberal, to make things more extreme. And it would then put politicians who are opposed to that in quite a disadvantageous position, because then you're arguing against the committee's recommendations. It's not you're arguing against other politicians, you are going against the experts, you're going against the science. And it's a very useful trick politically. And I can absolutely see why people would want it. And given the current government, I wouldn't be terribly surprised if there are a couple of people in there who would also enjoy something like this, either because they would support its aims or because they don't want to deal with it themselves.
One thing that strikes me reading through the points that have been consistently raised over the last few days, from the activist perspective, we see. I thought it was cute. The quote now from whatever it was a day to 10 a day. I think in the past it was now. They're saying every one woman a day is traveling to England, for example. They're saying that the National Women's Council is saying that the 12-week limit is extremely problematic, because many women don't know that they're pregnant until their 10th week, and that needs to be changed. But there are issues with the fact that you have such a limited number of doctors, particularly in certain areas. People are having to travel 10 hours there and back. Only half the hospitals in the country are carrying out abortions. This might sound a slightly naive observation, but in all of the discussion, everything that has been raised has been about raising accessibility or facilitating abortion, on the basis that during the referendum, the numbers that we have seen actually eventuating would have been considered to be very high. And on the basis that everybody kept saying, rare, we want abortion to be rare. Have you heard, maybe I've missed it, anybody coming out with suggestions of how we might actually reduce the number of abortions, rather than simply seeing this simply as a question of how we make accessing abortion easier?
No, in fact, I've seen some of the organizations come out and say that the numbers we're seeing and the fact they've remained steady during the last year with everything that's going on shows that abortion is a healthcare service which there is a demand for. And just on that idea of it being rare, a lot of the activist groups view this as a human right. It never made sense for them to want it to be rare in any sense. Their concern is that anyone who wants an abortion can get an abortion. If that's rare or common, it doesn't matter to them. What they want is that anyone can get it because they view it as basically a fundamental human right. So we're not going to hear these people talking about the need for abortions to be kept rare or anything like that now that we're outside of a point where they're saying things to the public. Because even then it didn't make sense. Because it's not what they are concerned about. They've never been concerned about it. They want access, and they want as broad an access as possible. And outside of the referendum period, they were pretty open about this, and they remain about it now. Now, they were a bit misleading during the referendum, but I don't think anyone who had followed these groups seriously believed them when they said it, because it just didn't make sense. How can you fight for widening access to something and say you want to drive the numbers down?
Yeah, but there was always that incongruity, wasn't there? At one time, we knew, because we knew these people, we heard them speak, that they regarded this as in a sense, a morally null question. They were impatient and annoyed with the idea that you should investigate the moral quality of the act, because this was something which was just obviously a right, and not just a right, but an absolutely necessary right if women were to be in any sense free. If a woman were to be any sense free or liberated, this was just a basic right, and she should not have to justify it in any way. There should be no questions, and it should be, as you say, to viability and well beyond. in fact. But at the same time, during the campaign, we heard this language, not from everyone, but for a lot of people saying, oh, but nobody will have an abortion flippantly. Nobody will have it glibly. This is a very serious question for women. It's a terrible thing. So there was a slight, shall we say, a dissonance between the positions in public. But I suppose before as we finish up, as we go forward, if you're on the side where you actually do want to reduce the number of abortions, and you don't want to see, say, an abortion on demand regime operating in the country, is there an opportunity there to exploit that dissonance, that perceived public dissonance? Or if there's, what direction do pro-life people in Ireland have to go? What kind of language do they have to use? What is the most fruitful approach now to speak to those people that we have to believe are in there in the middle, who don't actually want abortion on demand or anything like it? People who I know I spoke to that ended up voting for repeal, who were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of allowing abortion in the case of handicap. We have 117 abortions for children with handicap, disability. They were very deeply conflicted by that, but because, going back to your point, ultimately they believed that this was something which was killing women. That was the choice that they felt they had to make. How do we speak to them?
So I think that there's three strands to this. There's political, there's personal, and there's cultural. And I'll talk at length on each of them, but I'll briefly touch on them so that we can close up. When we talk about the referendum and information, and people need to be aware of issues, people need to be aware of some of these statistics. They need to be given them in an upfront way where no one is trying to say, and that's a good thing, that they're just being given the facts so that they can then make a decision. In relation to that, you have organizations like Gript on the media front putting out things like this and trying to make people aware of things that other parts of the Irish media simply don't cover. And not just in relation to abortion. I think there has been a lot that Gript has covered that simply falls outside the interest of the media. I think that's the first thing you need to have. You need to have somewhere where people can actually find this information, and not during the heat of a campaign when everyone is an activist and they have reason to distrust you. They need to be able to find it continuously, basically, so that they are able to get a sense of where we actually are and where we're going that is accurate, and from people that they can trust. And I think that's the big thing we need to remember here. I talked to activists during the campaign about things like saying that, well, people thought this was going to kill women. And they would say, well, we told them it wasn't, and we gave them these leaflets and we showed them the facts. And you have to sort of go, but you're an activist. Why would they trust you? So it's not just about getting the information out there. It's getting the information out there to people in a way that is trustworthy and where they can, over time, come to realize that you're not lying to them or you're not trying to mislead them, but these are the stats. And that, I think, is a more long-term thing. On a personal level, I think a large part of what people can do is get involved in pro-life groups, whether that is donating to groups or whether that is even the social side of groups, setting up coffee mornings, meeting people, keeping in touch with people, building a network of people that you can talk to about these issues, and keeping something active on the ground in the same way political parties used to do it. A lot of the political parties was actually just pretty much socializing and getting to know people, knowing there were people there you can trust and who feel the same on these issues. And then if a political issue comes up, well, then you and those people can act together in a way that you can't do on your own. And they'll also support you when you're doing things, whether that's a letter writing campaign, whether that is talking to a TD, anything like that. And I think people really undervalue how important social events like that actually are, and just the keeping in touch with people and trying to build it. Just a network of people and welcoming new people into it, particularly people who maybe in the referendum went a way that they now think wasn't a good way. I've seen a lot of people say that those people should be, they should be black sheeps. They shouldn't be. They made a terrible mistake, and we should turn them away. And I think the core of a lot of this is forgiveness and acceptance of people, and accepting that people can come to a different view on things that is absolutely worth considering, even in light of past behavior. And I think that sort of urge to keep this incredible purity is harmful, because you need to accept people who will have had different views on this. And as I said, for 10 years, people were being told this killed women. It's not surprising if people came to a particular view and only now reconsidering it have a different view. So I think you've got to be welcoming as well of not just the people who have, you know, solidly pro-life, have been involved in the movement for years, but also reach out to those who maybe are reconsidering things, who dealing with people where they are, as opposed to refusing to deal with them unless they come to you. And there's stuff you can do on the ground to do that. As I said, I won't go into it at great length, because then we would just stay forever. And finally, I think is political. Politicians in Ireland don't actually need that many votes to get elected. Or well, I should actually more accurately say the difference between a politician who gets elected and a politician who doesn't get elected in Ireland is very small. And a small group of people in a constituency who make it clear to a politician that they will vote, because if you don't vote, it doesn't matter to them, but that they will vote, and that they will vote for you if you do something, and that they won't vote if you do something else. That is a very powerful motivating force for politicians. And it is something that I think we tend to forget about, because we assume politicians aren't on side. So we don't attempt to reach out to them, ask to meet with them, ask what they're doing in a polite fashion. You don't get aggressive with them, you don't do it, but let them know your views, let them know you're there, and let them know that you're watching and that you're keeping all of this in mind. And then if you want to expand into that, there are things like canvassing for politicians. Every politician, particularly at the moment, it was different 20, 30 years ago, politicians are in desperate need for canvassers. Anyone who is, you know, if you say, look, if you do this, not only will I vote for you, but I will canvass for you, I will do something like that. Get involved with political parties, with political people, because even though the party as a whole may not be supportive of certain things, there will people who are inside it who are. And once you're inside it, you can then try and put forward your view to those people, many of whom are heavily involved in politics and might be more willing to listen to you than you would think. Now, that's not always going to be an option. Certain political parties are not going to be interested in it. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to disengage from politics entirely and assume that everything is lost and these people are evil and therefore we shouldn't deal with them. Because if you do that and they don't think you're going to vote, they don't think you're going to do anything, they will then totally ignore your position. Whereas at least if they think you're going to vote and it'll be against them, they know that, they know they're losing votes. And in some instances, they'll be able to see votes.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's almost more powerful is the negative than the positive. That sense that, you know what, if you don't do this and you don't come through in what you've said, we're going to vote for somebody else. And you know what? We don't care. He could be the devil. We don't agree with anything, but you will lose your seat. And I think that underlying thing, that has been used particularly in the United States by a lot of groups. It's been very effective. Gary, thanks a million for joining us. It's been really interesting. I'd like to thank our viewers out there for coming in again. I'd like to again invite you to subscribe, and if you can, to hit the donate button. I can promise you anything you give will be used to defend those life values that we all share. Until the next time, thank you, Gary, and thank you, folks, and stay well.